Asia's richest countries are facing an economic time bomb, and it has nothing to do with oil. Here in Singapore, as well as in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, the birth rate has plunged to its lowest level on record. And politicians across the continent are wondering who is going to drive the next cycle of economic growth, staff the military and provide for the elderly. I'm Taimur Nabili, and on this edition of 101 East, we ask, can Asia's economies survive without more babies? Just a generation ago, the Singapore government was so concerned about a population explosion on this tiny island, it actively discouraged large families. The Stop at 2 policy was partially responsible for a birth rate that plummeted from more than 6 children per family to less than 2 today. Howell Davis now reports on how the Singapore government is frantically scrambling to reverse that trend.
It's a city living at high speed. Since independence just over 40 years ago, Singapore has experienced explosive growth, transforming the lives of its citizens. But that's had some unwelcome consequences. Among them, a huge drop in fertility, falling to a record low in 2007, the 28th successive year it's dropped. For single women like Noelle Tan, it's partially because there's simply no time to meet potential partners.
It's very easy to get carried away with your day-to-day, and if say things like, oh, I'm too busy to date, or I work all the time, or weekends I sleep, or that sort of excuses. So yeah, maybe to answer your question, some women do fall into that, like, where got time? It's a very typical Singaporean thing.
Even couples who are already together have trouble conceiving, medical experts say. That's partially because most lifestyles are focused on work, not play.
In fact, the fertility rate is also linked to the number of times of intercourse. And in Singapore, the likely reason is that people are just too stressed to have sex. They're too tired at the end of the day. So the number of times of intercourse has dropped as well. So fertility rate is directly linked to that.
But the failure to have children is also due to other fundamental factors. One of which is the vast change in women's expectations and desires over the last 2 decades.
Over the last 20 years, education level has gone up and up. The females are very well involved in education, involved in the society, involved in the economy. So women are more and more educated. They tend to spend more time at work and climb up the corporate ladder, which is why they tend to get married a little bit later.
That's led many Singaporean women to put off having children until their late 20s or 30s, and to settle for having 1 or 2. That's not enough to replace the numbers of Singaporeans dying or emigrating. The Sows have decided to limit their family to their one daughter, Angie. They won't be having any more children, and in fact initially hadn't wanted any at all.
We probably don't see ourselves wanting to bring up a kid. We know, we anticipate it's going to be a very tough process, and we just don't see ourselves wanting to go through that process.
It's a far cry from the late 60s and 70s, when the Singaporean government was worried about overpopulation. It introduced policies aimed at reducing the number of children born, calling for people to stop at 2. Many women opted for sterilisation, and others were put under pressure to do so.
I was always scolded and told off when I went to the clinic. They would say, "Why do you have so many children?" When I went to the doctors, they even told me to have my tubes tied. I didn't want to.
But since the mid-1980s, the government has actively been encouraging young Singaporeans to have children. Classes in sensual dancing are among those set up by the government-run Social Development Unit. It also provides advice to those interested in dating and has matchmaking services available. Lydia Gan runs a dating service that gets government funding. She says the SDU used to have a reputation for attracting those who couldn't find partners elsewhere, but that's changing.
In the past, there's this social stigma against SDU. They call it the single, desperate, ugly club. So, but that stigma has been fading over the years. A survey has shown that singles are more and more proactive in attending social events and matchmaking services.
This Singaporean approach is almost certainly unique, with some calling it social engineering. But the city-state is hardly alone in suffering low fertility. In almost all countries where women have gained access to education, birth rates have fallen sharply. Much of Europe has had low rates for decades. While in East Asia, countries like South Korea, Japan and Taiwan have only slightly higher fertility rates per woman. Hong Kong is even lower, with women on average having just one child, far below the level needed to replace its population. Just a few kilometres from Singapore city centre lies the island of Kusu. Here, childless couples come to ask for divine assistance. But Singapore, along with its wealthy Asian neighbours, needs more reliable methods of boosting its population. That primarily means immigration. Singapore has introduced policies aimed at increasing the country's number of immigrants. Other countries like Japan and South Korea are less used to the idea, but they face dire consequences if they don't lower their barriers to entry.
You have continuing very low birth rates. You have a downward spiral in population. If the sorts of fertility rates that you have in Japan now were to continue for long enough, and you didn't have migration, the Japanese population would just about disappear in 200 years. There'd be none left.
That's a prospect that has belatedly got governments across the region racing to address their fertility problems. But whether they have the courage to embrace immigration or can persuade their own people to have more children remains an open question.
Joining me for today's conversation about Asia's declining birth rate, we have Pauline Strawn, who's Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore. Philip Bowring is a journalist based in Hong Kong. And Tan Joo Him, former President of the Association of Women for Action and Research in Singapore. And we're coming to you today from the Singapore River overlooking the famous Boat Quay, where I suppose, Pauline, the social development unit that Singapore is known for would be very happy to think that on a Friday night people are interacting with each other. How seriously does that unit and the Singapore government take this issue of population?
Well, I think that not just the unit, but rather, the state in general is very concerned about population growth and the total fertility rate. As you know, Singapore is, we're totally dependent on manpower. And the TFR has been going south since the mid-1980s. So
TFR being total fertility
rate, I'm sorry. So this means that it becomes a national effort then to get our young to first of all get married, and then procreate, right, within the setting of a legally recognized union.
But obviously they want to encourage that. But Joo Him, is there a sense, do you think, here and around Asia, that there is a crisis afoot?
I think a lot of countries in Asia are very worried because there's an aging population. But perhaps the way that some governments are going about it is not actually bringing about the desired results. For example, in Singapore, the predominant effort is a cash incentive, and most people feel that it's not going about it in the correct way. Mm-hmm.
Philip, some people would say that this Malthusian panic, if you like, will be just as irrelevant as the initial fears that we had 20 years ago about overpopulation, that somehow this will sort itself out, as these things tend to.
Well, I mean, that's certainly possible, but I mean, at the moment, if you look at East Asia, or at least developed East Asia, and particularly predominantly Chinese developed East Asia, i.e. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they have some of the lowest rates of the world, in the world. In fact, Hong Kong is the lowest. And then you've got Korea and Japan, not very far behind. And then, of course, China, which, forgetting the one-child policy for a moment, just look at the major cities in China where the total fertility rate is about the same as it is in Hong Kong.
Yeah, Joo Him, I mean, how would you categorize the situation with regards to the impetus to have children right now?
One main consideration is the quality of life. When we did a survey in 2004, I think one of the main reasons people hesitated about having children was the quality of life, the high stress education, the high stress at work, and also the high cost of living. And I think in Singapore is one of the more developed countries with very few work flexibility options. Bosses expect employers to be in a chair 9 to 5 or probably 9 to 9. And it makes childbearing and childrearing rather difficult. And also the higher opportunity cost placed on women, because there's only maternity and no paternity leave in Singapore. So employers view women of childbearing age as a liability because we go off to have children, we take 10 weeks, 12 weeks off work.
Stress issues, there must be more to it than that. I mean, has there been, either in Singapore or elsewhere that you're aware of, specific scientific study that's pinpointed what has led developed nations to stop having children?
Something dramatic has changed, and that is the status of women, right? Clearly, from all the studies that we have done, we see that one of the barriers to high fertility is the options now available to women. And in Singapore, this is not different, right? We have the problem now we have is with young women, particularly those coming straight out of university, marriage and parenthood is not top on their priority.
Phil.
But I would point out here that if we look at the countries where the birth rate, the fertility rate has actually started going up again, we're looking at Scandinavia, we're looking at Northern Europe generally, Netherlands, we're looking at New Zealand, very high birth rate in New Zealand. These are all places where women have a very high status, both in the workplace and in government and in pretty well every sphere. So clearly women do actually want to have children, or at least most of them, if the other conditions are right.
Let's pause there for just a moment. We'll have to take a short break. Stay with us. We'll come back with more on this discussion in just a couple of minutes.